Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another cover seminar. For today, we're having a chat here with Jean Ray. Thanks for coming along, Jean. Um, um, I'm not someone who usually likes doing very formal introduction, so I will say that I think I first came across your work, Jean, maybe about 15 years or so ago when you first did a book with edited with Gerald Ronig, the Critique of Creativity book, which was published by Mayfly Books. I think it's quite interesting because at that point Mayfly was housed at Essex, and it was coming to this world of people who, let's say, aren't officially part of organization studies or have anything to do with business schools, but like through Mayfly, I think the things like ephemera have some connection to worlds we share. So I thought that was quite interesting, and also interesting to think about now because you said you're doing another book with them called what's it called, Making Now Time,
Yes, making now time.
which I'm guessing is a Benjamin reference.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Excellent. Well, it's a very good day to talk about making now time because I feel like Zoran Mamdani might have actually gone and made us some now time.
Yeah.
So this week for this event we're going to be talking with Gene about his relatively newish book After the Holocene, which is quite good. So with that intro out of the way, I will just hand it over to you, Gene, to do your thing.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everyone, or hello. So I will just read a short introduction in order to get to discussion as quickly as possible. So the idea for this book began with the suspicion that hard times were coming. The roads of late capitalist modernity are leading to terrible troubles. The growing drumbeat of war, mutating fascisms, and the subversion of basic democratic rights, the emergence of a post-truth information space, the rise of the billionaire oligarchs, the quasi-merger of big tech and big data with the national security state, the instability of global economies dominated by accelerated algorithmic finance capital, and above all, the catastrophic heating and toxification of the biosphere. So these tendencies indicated to me that late capitalist modernity had become a war, disaster, and extinction machine. The corrupted and decomposed party left is clearly not up to dealing with any of this. Up to this day, they remain incapable of even speaking honestly about it. To me, it seemed clear and still seems clear that most of us will soon have to deal with a level of everyday hardship that few people are ready to acknowledge. We have, in the past 10 years, lived through the emergence of a new intensified climate imperialism, the imminent drift of which is toward climate fascism and a new world war. New disruptive technologies such as AI and gene editing are being heedlessly weaponized and rushed into market and battle spaces without any serious public debate or national self-restraint. AI in particular will intensify all these antagonisms and accelerate the social and ecological ruination. Clearly, nothing short of a social and political revolution can address these problems, but global revolution is not now on the agenda. So, what to do? I first started thinking about commenting as a rational response to this appalling situation. As I understand it, commenting is not just the management of pooled resources. More expansively, it's a local mode of production, social reproduction, and social enjoyment. In this sense, commenting is a vector of provisioning and decommodification that will help us out in the coming hard times. Reskilling and commenting for basic needs are a course of prudence, and it's this dimension that I began exploring in a workshop called Left Wing Prepping in collaboration with a politically engaged art space in Athens called State of Concept. But soon enough, I felt the need to go further and to try to think commenting as potentially a central term and concept in a larger project of leftist counter-hegemony. The accumulation of capital and the development of productive forces have combined to produce a socio-ecological polycrisis and evolutionary swerve that are plainly existential. We are crazy if we commoners on the left, do not seize this opportunity to show that capitalism can no longer justify itself as the best and only system around. Indeed, a capitalism that cannot restrain itself from ruining the very conditions of complex life on Earth is no longer even rational. We need to grab that with both hands, the catastrophic metabolic irrationality of contemporary modernity. In the last few years, especially, in which genocide has been perpetrated openly and the US has led the world into rearming and going all in again on fossil fuels and AI, it's no exaggeration to say that late capitalist modernity has lost its right to exist by any rational criteria and evaluation. It clearly is an automaton that cannot restrain itself even from racing itself to death. What kind of hegemony, what kind of ruling class leadership is that? In this context, I wrote this book as a frontal attack on capitalist realism and its common sense. As I read Gramsci, the battle over hegemony always comes down to common sense and who gets to set the terms of it. It's urgent, is it not, that we take down capitalist realism and contest capitalist common sense in its deepest roots, from its techno-optimist myths of automatic progress to geopolitics, its strategic form, what can be called imperialist realism. But we have a better and more rational realism, biospheric realism, the central concept of my book. Biospheric realism holds simply that the conditions of life and livability must come first. Humans are not separate from the biosphere, we depend on it. In the biosphere, as on the factory floors, an injury to one is an injury to all. The sixth mass extinction is not just a scandal, it's an ecocidal catastrophe that will become genocidal. So biospheric realism, all human and social and political projects must align with the needs of a flourishing biosphere and inhabitable climate. Non-negotiable, full stop. There cannot be a higher priority than life itself. Isn't that common sense? And the implications are, if late capitalism has become a reckless extinction machine, then it has to be turned off by whatever means necessary. In my book, I develop this idea and link biospheric realism to commoner subjectivity, open to more than human mutualism. I argue that commoning is something we can and should do now, beginning with small local systems that can link up in what Massimo De Angelis calls commons ecologies. Commonization, also Massimo's term, is a collective practice in line with biospheric realism. At local scales, it can reverse the direction of ruination and shift the metabolic interaction with the planet. Commonization does not bring us directly, immediately into head-on violent conflict with the capitalist state. It will eventually, of course, but for now it's legal and it can buy us some time in which to reskill and develop our capacities for mutualism. Commonization is a strategy of prudence and indirection. It opens a terrain for politicized practice. That also serves the provisioning of basic needs and alleviates the metabolic rift. Commoning by itself cannot disarm, power down, and abolish capitalism. Let's not get carried away. But commoning as a vector of mutualism and decommodified production offers first steps in that direction. It's a buildable infrastructure from below, one that aligns with and models biospheric realism. The task we face, given what's been dropped on us, is immense and difficult. I don't want to minimize or soft pedal this. Nothing here will be easy to do. Beyond commoning, what we really need to pull off, there's no avoiding it, and we can't be hesitant to say it, is to disarm, power down, and abolish capitalism. A revolutionary program at a time when the revolutionary subjects have left the field. Bringing them back is common sense. We all know we need to slow down and degrow the social metabolism at a time when all dominant trends are racing in the other direction. It seems obvious that forms of eco-socialism are called for, even if these are excluded from official public debate. We have to begin, it seems to me, with the project of counter-hegemony, the battle of ideas. Capital obviously enjoys a loaded deck here, but for all the reasons I just summarized, that battle is winnable. Reason, feeling, and experience are on our side, not on the side of capital. So we need to get this message out in every possible channel in order to bring this debate. Ultimately, though, there's no easy passage out of late capitalist modernity, and yet that passage is the least catastrophic option. That, too, is part of commoners' sense. We will have to get beyond the organizational stasis and rebuild revolutionary agencies and capacities. A collective revolutionary subject will have to recompose itself, if only as a survival imperative. We will be assisted in this by the planet itself, which is registering its own practical critique of late capitalism. And that practical critique will only become forceful with each year of wildfires, floods, and superstorms. The experience of this will be radicalizing. In my book, I offer a first elaboration of all of this. I attack capitalist technology and the attention economy, the smartphone and its world, as the last gasp of mythical automatic progress. We've been enslaved, have we not, to the needs of these technologies and infrastructures. Governments no longer act to promote human happiness. They act to expand and secure the digital and AI infrastructures. If we are not slaves to big tech, then let us prove it. If we are, then the task of all slaves is collective self-liberation. I attack the capitalist food system, the ruinous globalized monocultural plantation system that since its colonial beginnings has been an ecocide and genocide machine. Replacing the system with localized agroecology is a priority second only to the abolition of the fossil fuel sector. I link agroecology to indigenous land struggles, especially across the global south. No land, no justice, no justice, no peace. How does commoning relate to the frankly revolutionary project of eco-socialism? That is a key question. Eco-socialism would be the most direct way to power down and transition to a post-growth social metabolism, consistent with dignity, reason, and justice. Socialization of national economies and democratic planning could selectively abolish untenable economic sectors, beginning with fossil fuels and the monocultural plantation food system, and could redistribute investment toward the high-quality satisfaction of real human needs. That is already a revolutionary program. It will never be a gift from the capitalist classes. I agree with Massimo De Angelis here. Commoning is the content, eco-socialism is the form. Commoning is the mutualist association of direct producers, what used to be called worker self-management, direct democracy, council communism. If that is right, then in order to be eco-socialists, we can start by thinking of ourselves as commoners. To make a start without blinking away from the context of socio-ecological ruination is why I wrote this book. Commoner subjectivity builds itself around biospheric realism and a new common sense. It must be mutualist and also more than human. In order to be those things, it will also have to be internationalist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist. The task of all commoners is to rescue livability. Biospheric livability is collective self-rescue, commoner's sense. Unhappily, no one gets to make history just as they like. To rescue livability, commoners need to take things as they find them and find the courage to do so. It may be that liberation from these late capitalist infrastructures will only come through their destruction by whatever means. Collapse might come before organized revolution. If another world war is forced on us, then revolutionary defeatism will again be order of the day. We are not now ready for any of this, and none of it is nice to think about, but this is the world the capital has made. And the capitalist classes that we are stuck with are no less intransigent than those of the past. They will fight savagely to keep control over the machine, even if it is an extinction machine. Well, at least commoners have conviviality. Decommodified social enjoyment is on our side, and that is something at least. Okay, thank you. I hope that's enough to get the discussion started.
Thanks, Gene. I think that gives us some good points to start from. Um, Maybe what I'll attempt to kick off the discussion and see where we go. Um, one of the things I really like about your book is okay. So when people talk about capitalist hegemony, right, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's a materially produced practice. Comes out a whole range of things. Here we can think about the way, for instance, like Sun Rathal talks about how the commodity structures everyday life and consciousness, right? And what I like about your book is when you're talking about how if you're trying to break away from this kind of catastrophic direction we're going in, you you don't just change ideas by just saying, ah, this is bad, here's this instead. Rather, there's kind of micro practices which then lead somewhere else. And by being involved in commenting practices, you start to think differently by doing the thing that leads you to thinking differently first. And I kind of like that way, almost look at the sort of the cooperative practice and then go from there. I think it's a quite interesting way to sort of think about it.
Thank you. I mean, we're unused to thinking about it in this way, but commons are everywhere. We're all participating in commons all the time. We just don't recognize them as such. So we have a place to begin.
Have you ever seen that really cheesy, horrible rom-com Love Actually?
No.
Okay, I was thinking you could do sort of like Commons Actually, like because the title is like Love Actually is all around you. Commons Actually, or or I'm thinking of that David Graeber text. Are you an anarchist? The answer might surprise you, which is all about sort of like everyday forms of micro sociality where people engage in free cooperation without being commanded, without thinking, without realizing they're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, capitalism, I mean, succeeds in capturing most of this stuff and valorizing it for themselves. Um, but I think the potential insurgency of recognizing commons for what they are would change that a bit. But I agree. I mean, we're already in micro practices, so we can extrapolate from there. But certainly, commons is about, if it's about anything, it's about basic needs. So the food system, for example, energy. These are fundamental parts of the problem that commoning could address: decentralization and commoning.
I also really like the way that you connect commenting to biospheric realism. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times, the moment you talk about commons, the people will bring up, oh no, but what about the tragedy of the commons? And it's the idea that people will sort of overuse any sort of freely available resource. But what I like about thinking about commenting as an active verb in the way Massimo talks about it is people who are engaged in commons are always very conscious of needing to reproduce and keep sustainable the thing that they're involved in. Otherwise, it would fall apart, right? And so developing a sense of sort of biospheric realism is actually, if anything, helped by a commenting perspective because you need to think about, what are the conditions necessary to keep agriculture alive? What are the conditions of reproduction?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that argument about the tragedy of the commons, I think, was well answered by Eleanor Ostrom, and people do understand that, if you have a commons with no rules, then you could have that kind of unchecked exploitation of the resource. But it's never like that. The commons are always self-managed with a view to sustainability. Exactly.
Hmm. But I mean, and that's what the work that people also like, Massimo has done. It's very important to thinking about commenting not as something that exists outside of time, but as a constantly produced and reproduced relationship, where and how those commons are managed, which is again which is someone like Eleanor is very important as well.
Yeah, I mean, Massimo's systems theory approach really made sense to me. Um commons are operating anywhere you have commoners producing a common good, a good in common, a use value for the plurality, according to commoning practices. Those three things. So that helps us to see commons where we might not be looking. And it also, I mean, this idea of commonization, where smaller micro commons or local based commons can link up into more complex ecologies, I think is incredibly important. No one knows how far such commons ecologies can scale up, but it would be interesting to find out.
Mm. Malte?
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to follow up on what you just said right now about scaling up. So it seems really plausible to me that when you say there's a lot of sort of common local knowledge, understanding, intelligibility of commons practices on how it's essential, to preserve sort of the foundations of life and so on. It seems like a lot of people kind of have a really solid common sense understanding of this. But once we scale up kind of to the interactions, for example, of nation states, there's always this problem that there's some kind of willingness, perhaps some desire to move away from fossil fuels, for example. But then if any state does this unilaterally in the context of a global competitive economy, they'll have all sorts of disadvantages, so they don't do it. There's this big collective action problem that's sort of mediated by no one, because there's no sort of entity that governs the interactions of nation states. So yeah, so what's your sort of take on the problem of how nation states interact and how they get trapped in these collective action problems?
Yeah, thank you. It's an important question. I mean, I think commons operates between the state and economy, or between public and private. Um, I think by their own logic, commons has to be a bit hostile to the nation state form. And once you reach the nation state form and accept the premise of the nation state, then the logic of geopolitics becomes, inescapable. Um, and so we have to have a rupture with that logic, because there's no way out within the logic of nation state imperialism. Every state is obligated to pursue and maximize its own national power and the power of its economy. Every nation state is obligated to become a national security state, guarding its borders. So commons, that's part of what I mean by commons are tendentially internationalist. They have to be internationalist in order to be more than human, like, let's say, in order to take on fully the implications of biospheric realism, means that you have to think beyond and higher than any nation state and its borders. So ultimately, the nation state and nationalism, of course, are problems that will have to be overcome. They're bottlenecks on the development of the commons, as well as bottlenecks to solving the problems that we're faced with. We have seen how well nation states deal with problems like planetary heating or toxification. They don't. So we need to find an exit from that closed loop that reproduces itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, I find myself in much intuitive agreement, but I also wonder a lot, sort of, given how vast the tasks are that nation states currently carry out. So the number of things that they do for us, not just bad, but also kind of helpful, practical coordination stuff. What kind of takes their place in a but I don't want to take up too much time. I'm aware that there's many others in the chat. So yeah.
Thank you.
If there's time, what takes their place?
Sure.
I mean, one of the things way I think about it is I think commenting practices can be very important, almost as like key learning spaces. And what I mean by that is if you look at most of the organizations we're in, we're not treated often as people who are capable of self-organizing, making decisions collectively. We're treated oftentimes there's relationships of command. So what spaces do we learn how to actually organize differently in? And I think that can be extremely valuable because, okay, to give you another example, 2001 Argentina, right? After the economy collapsed, there were a bunch of sort of worker-owned and run factories. Those skills didn't come out of nowhere, but were developed elsewhere. And where people kept had people banging on about collective self-organization, that then when there was a moment of crisis, those skills then could take a form where they could exist otherwise. So I think a lot of it's not sort of common practices are magically going to replace the nation state tomorrow, but rather if you have a sort of process of proliferating such that moments of crisis, and people go, oh well, how about we just run it ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think so. I think this is partly what Massimo is aiming at when he says that eco-socialism is the form, but commenting is the content. What's actually going on in eco-socialism, which is a higher scale, let's say national scale project, is that the decision making process devolves to actually different comments. So this is how that could work. And again, we don't know how big that can be because we don't have any examples of it yet. But yeah, beautiful. That's a great book. Hey,
D
David.
cross.
Hello, and thank you so much, Gene. That was a frightening but inspiring introduction to your thought on this subject. We've had many interesting conversations in this area. So for me, the question of violent expropriation or appropriation of the commons, which has plagued the commoners for centuries, might be posed more vigorously, more insistently in the decaying and ecologically fragile world we're entering into. Reading Giovanni Arrigi's history of the development of the capitalism within the world interstate system, he looks at what he describes as oppositional forces. One is capital accumulation, and the other one is territorial expansion. And territorial expansion doesn't conform to the same values or same logic as capital accumulation. It's very anchored, it's rooted in place, it's about people and soil and terrain command rather than negotiation. Whereas capital accumulation is fluid and mobile and moves across borders. But what's historically happened is that we've had a dialectical movement, a kind of expedient alliance between these opposing forces. I'll get to my point, which is that the values of capitalism about self-interest, flexibility, and exchange between all forms of social practice being reduced to a kind of economic transaction are almost completely opposed by the values of the military. And I've just been looking at the British Army's statement on its values: courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, and selfless commitment. These align really closely with what you're speaking of here, which is not about self-interest, but selflessness. And the question of we can't confront the military aspect of capitalism full on because they'll kill us. Is there any possibility that in a revolutionary moment, the army, the coercive arm of the state, could somehow recognize the greater value inherent in commoning? Because if we could recruit the army to lay down their weapons and not use live rounds against demonstrators in a food shortage, for example, there's an enormous potential for progress there. Whereas if we ultimately face the use of deadly force and we're peaceful people, the project will run dry when it hits the confrontation.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, first, I mean, I think you're right. The military does enact a kind of socialism, and that's well recognized. In terms of revolutionary violence, I think it's important to shed the illusion that there's a peaceful electoral road to eco-socialism. There's not. Capitalist classes will never allow that. Mm-hmm. Nor can the capitalist state simply be taken over and made to serve different purposes. Its technologies used in a different way. It would have to be, as Marx and Lenin put it, smashed and reorganized completely differently. But no one imagines that revolutionary strategy is about confronting the militaries that exist directly where they have such an advantage. It's about turning the military or producing a social crisis of hegemony that's so deep and widespread that it enters into the military as well. And so in such a situations, that would be the way in which, certainly that happened in October, in February to October 1917 in Russia. The soldiers were among the most radical group in the soldiers, workers, and peasants that made that revolution. So it helped that there was a war going on that everybody realized was, just a pointless, irrational slaughter. So revolutionary strategy is what Lenin called revolutionary defeatism. We're not going to try to defend our imperialist nation and its ruling classes in the event of war. So I agree with you there. We have to rethink all those things. Of course, the whole discussion about revolution and social movements has been stuck at this level of debate about organizations, horizontal or vertical, or some combination of the two. But we have to solve those problems and move beyond that. In that sense, commons are unproblematically horizontalist organizations, but it's not clear that everything can be horizontal like that. So anyway, I myself am open to a combination of vertical and horizontal forms of organization that would be capable of conducting the struggle for counter hegemony against an enemy that is centralized, hierarchical, and absolutely well funded. So that's the reality. That's what we're up against. I don't know what it seems like there are a lot of irrational possibilities of war and so forth, nuclear proliferation again, that are impending on the next decade. We'll see what happens. But if there is war, I hope that popular disgust over that will again produce a similar situation as in the past. Otherwise, I don't know what we do. I mean, if there's no change in this balance of forces, obviously we can't do much more. We can do commenting. We can make commons and commons ecologies. That was part of the point of the book, is that this is what we can do now. We aren't going to get repressed for doing this, at least at the moment.
Camilla?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for a great book, and the discussion has been great. I want to tie a little bit Malte's and Stephen's questions by asking you, what is the role of law or regulation in order to bring about basically these common ecologies? Because one of the things that, of course, this already exists. You know, the realities of commoning already exist all over the world. However, it has been very difficult to replicate it. And sometimes there is attempts, and regulation from the nation state is really not allowing for those commoning experiences to basically exist or, become more normal. In other instances, they are fostered by regulation, and allowing them to do easy things or to bypass regulation, that especially, for example, cooperatives, and how do you basically interact with the existing world, right? Which is a world that is against any experience of commoning. So one of the things that I would tie with Malte's pushing, I agree that the nation state, it is not the site of struggle. It is, as Rancière would say, all states are oligarchic. We cannot really, go at that level. However, the international sphere is a kind of loops back, at least in the law part. International law, in a way, it is not an imposition on states, but states are supposed to update their regulatory frameworks according to the regulations that are passed in international levels. So what is the role of this kind of rules for commoning that we can actually put in place or push for at other levels in order to foster this alternative reality, in a way, the alternative future? And also, I didn't see a take on democracy in terms of the ways that we govern ourselves. And this is where Stephen, I think it was asking a little bit kind of like that. How do we organize ourselves? We don't know really how to. And because in the book, I think democracy is more electoral democracy. And of course, we don't agree with that. but what would democracy look like in this alternative future, in a way, if from your perspective? That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the historical examples that we have to indicate that would be something like the Paris Commune, where everyone decides. There's universal direct suffrage, but civil servants or people who are empowered by their electors are recallable at all times, revocable. And are paid no more than the salary of a wage worker. So that's a revolutionary form of democracy compared to the bourgeois models. But if we look at this as a long-term struggle for counter hegemony, to depose capitalist realism and put something better in its place, perhaps biospheric realism, then of course we also have to contest the fields of the state and law. So we should go and be willing to go as far as possible in all those fields, changing law, earth law, for example. But the limitations of international law are also clear. They're part of the capitalist nation state and interstate system. So the limitations are built in. It's okay. International law over the last year was able to arrive at a condemnation of Israel for genocide, but it wasn't able to stop it. because international law is only enforceable by the most powerful nations. And if they decide that that's not a law they want, they simply will block it. And that's what's happened. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of scope for commons to grow, commons ecologies to develop into something like infrastructures legally within the spaces that exist. But ultimately, counter hegemony would imply, yes, a struggle within the law for a better form of democracy. So, I mean, commons, we know, are democracies that make their law each time when they decide how to produce something together and how to share the benefits of it. Something like that on a larger scale would be new to the world. I mean, the example we have is certainly the Paris Commune, as opposed to Soviet-style bureaucracies where there are directors and executants, and a new form of exploitation develops, a new class system. So the challenges are great, but I think the 20th century has to be worked through for sure, but is not, for me, absolutely discouraging toward these kinds of goals. But certainly the perceptions about what happened in the 20th century and the discrediting of ideas like communism and socialism that were that followed the history of the 20th century are problems that have to be worked through. So again, the idea of a learning process, I think, is important, and it's also historical. So I know that doesn't really answer your question much. I don't know enough about municipal movements like Barcelona to know how they've appropriated law, but I imagine they're doing it.
Yeah, and how, because in the bureaucracy or the more statutory law and regulation, basically, for example, if we take the European Union, there are regulations about cooperatives, what cooperatives can do, what are the forms of it. So basically, it gives you a kind of a framework in which you need to manage, because if not, you're not legal, or it's very difficult to get financing or permits or whatever you need to produce what you're producing. I've been looking at energy communities. So basically there are different regulations, but they all need to conform with the European Union umbrella one. It's not overnight, right? But there is a struggle that is not so, important, quote unquote, or flashy, but it is a way of like, how do we translate the commoning in order in law, in regulation, in order to allow for the commoning experience to be feasible and not be completely a form of resistance that is very weak in a way, that it could be wiped out immediately. And of course, we're not talking about, of course, genocide, the idea of forcefully imposing, but kind of more surreptitiously imposing regulation, and up to academics in a way that there's public hearings, or there is reports, right? There is other kind of work that also is about commoning, because knowledge and the regulatory space is also a form of commons in a way. It is by definition in a way, supposedly. So the creation of rules, not only about how do we produce, but also how do we make decisions? Who is in and who is out? This is politics, what it's all about in a way. And we don't know anything about this. So in a way, there is the Paris Commune is a very, it's already in kind of an interface, and we are lacking more of a textured, understanding of how really decisions were made in detail. As we know, unions, all the places in which we operate are full of rules. Those rules are the creation of the space for commoning, I think, in a way, and may come organically while doing things, right? But also are codified in a way. And that is like the interface from the here to there, that I was referring in a way, and it's very inspiring. But I think we need to do more in a way in that area.
Yeah, that's great. That's that's important. I mean, the EU. I mean, that's an infamously, notoriously opaque, technocratic, bureaucratic process and structure. But some commoners need to know how to work it in order to get the codes to make space for commenting. So I mean, that's why I'm trying to think of it in a larger scale and longer term process. Counter hegemonic struggle would have to include all the necessary sites of struggle, and to turn these institutions like law or the EU into sites of liberation and struggle. Someone has to go into that process.
I don't know if I would understand the EU as a form of liberation. Don't go that far. I'm just saying that we need to kind of edit it and hack the system in a way that is also common in advancing in an oligarchic world. But then still thinking about the EU as an emancipatory space, no, I wouldn't agree with that.
Yeah, but although I mean, there are cities who have done a great deal that are in Europe and under these regulations. So they've found a way to navigate them.
If I could ask a kind of a follow-on thought question, one of the things you talk about is common ecologies and evolving the more than human in common ecologies, which I quite like. And I'm thinking here about the ways in which, again, almost in a legal framework, involving the more than human happens legally. So you have things in like Bolivia where sort of nature is understood to have rights in itself. Or I'm thinking of my friend Erin Manning has been doing a project where she's selling art to buy land with the purpose of giving the land back to itself, so the land owns itself. So I'm thinking about sort of ways in which you'd be trying to translate this commons ecology principle of legal self-ownership of nature into law, and how that works in a commons ecology.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Land is key. So I mean, land back or land to the tiller. These kinds of principles are of course blocked by capitalist property law, but the politics of commoning sooner or later has to push against the private ownership of land, and so an agrarian land politics is super important. And here we can connect to the indigenous land struggles for land back, and understand commoning as an ally in that political struggle. Yeah, no land, no justice. I mean, that's pretty clear. So this sounds like it sounds like a scheme to rewild by making the land itself the owner of itself. But ultimately, maybe the ownership itself would have to be called in question.
I agree. Sorry. It's very problematic, the idea of owning yourself, first of all, because that means that you can sell yourself. And commoning, or something that is a commons, is not a property, in a way. You hold it, you use it, you live in it, but you don't own it in the sense that you can exploit it beyond and sell. And I think that is something that it needs to be questioned. And of course, rights of nature, which I am very much in favor, because that is the framework that we have and has endured. It's still the idea that you have a right, as a property, because rights are a form of property first of ourselves, in a way. This is like the liberal, theory. Then you have a problem, because how can nature own already something? Owning something is not okay, in a way. So part of nature, right? So we are in a kind of a bind in that framework, even if we need to use it, and I think push for it, because this is the only language that is intelligible at this point. So, but I think, what do you think about that? But I think it is problematic.
Well, I think the problem there is how you find a way to attempt to undo the property relationship in the terms set by the property relationship. Like it's, yeah, that's difficult. But I mean, I think when I mentioned with Araeen, I think that's what she's trying to do is find a way to do that, even though it sounds very strange.
Yeah, we haven't found a way to implement the critique of anthropocentrism. That's where we're for the time being stuck. I mean, we can understand the importance of the more than human, but we haven't found the way to bring the more than human into human politics and human law. So there are attempts, and all those attempts should be encouraged. But that's also a long-term problem. But I mean, it was enough for me to point out in the book that biospheric realism is imposed on us by the ecological crisis. And the implication of biospheric realism is that commons have to take into account the more than human. So with that, we can work on how to do that.
Well, I guess we solved everything. Excellent. Oh, go ahead.
Malta, I think you're first.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The ecological understanding of the different aspects of the planetary ecosystem makes the distinction between land and sea, for example, more problematic. There's a very interesting report called The Economics of Water, the Global Hydrological Cycle as a Common Good, which identifies how the mist which drifts off forests as it evaporates from the leaves of the trees is what generates the rainfall across national borders, which enables nation states to feed their populations or to produce a surplus grain and trade it internationally. And so by mapping this flow of moisture through the rivers in the sky, it shows that it's no good owning a piece of physical land if you can't farm it, you can't use it to sustain life, because your neighbors thousands of miles away have destroyed their forests. And so the interconnection between land and water shows that the property rights, which say you own this land, you can do what you want with it, run completely counter to collective survival. And so I think that ecological thinking lends itself extremely well in very concrete ways to practices of commoning by showing that what we think we own is actually an illusion. There's no point owning it if you can't live with it and direct it in a way that's sustainable. So I'm hoping, and I really think that your book is going to give us a lot of traction here, that we can link to the scientific breakthroughs in understanding and somehow translate those into legal frameworks that are perhaps, hopefully, enforceable. So I think what you've given us is an overview of what's at stake and the scale and complexity of the problem, but that perhaps we can collectively own the knowledge that's been produced in the scientific research and use that to connect it to the legal frameworks to empower this transitional phase.
Yeah, thank you, David. Malta.
Yeah, thanks so much. The discussion is really interesting, and I'm not sure if this leads too far or if it's a bit too pedantical at this point. But just wondering about your discussion between Camilla and you about the nature of rights and the extent to which sort of existing liberal rights frameworks are helpful or not. The suspicion that I often have is that liberal rights, if they could be guaranteed and implemented, if they could actually be upheld, they'd be quite helpful. Capitalism can't do that. But for example, a right to self-ownership, like this idea that's so prominent in libertarianism, for example, that's not part of sort of the classical liberal conception of rights. We don't own ourselves. We sort of there's no right to sell ourselves away and so on. I'm often unsure as to whether I should think that these kinds of legal frameworks are obstacles in the way, or whether they should just be taken seriously, as it were, and implemented, which within our social system isn't possible. I'm leaning toward the latter. Yeah.
I mean, in this moment that we're having this discussion, the most basic civil rights are being rolled back in many places. The right to free speech and assembly. I mean, we're obligated to enter that battle and fight for the right to organize and speak freely. In this the genocide in Gaza has produced a chilling reaction, counter revolutionary thrust in many places, certainly the U.S. and Europe, about what can be said. So the liberal rights in the most basic sense that are attached to individuals may not be the paradigm we want to operate in ultimately, but insofar as we have to operate within national contexts, we have to pay attention to what's going on, to the right to assemble, the right to speak, the right to have a conscience against the official line. So I mean, in this time that we're living, I mean, it's a bit of a shock to imagine that we're back to that, but we are.
I mean, perhaps that's a sort of moment where you could bring in someone like Peter Linebaugh, who blurbs your book, and thinking about his work on the Magna Carta and the Treaty of the Forest, where you start with basically very early sort of nobles claiming rights for the king, but then it leads to rights which can be exercised to basically form commons and live together and manage collective resources.
Exactly.
Well, then, I think then we will it's maybe that'd be a good point to say thanks for coming along and thanks for having an interesting conversation, and we will keep on with this in the future. So thanks for that, Gene, and thanks for everyone for
Thanks,
coming along and chatting.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Gene. That was great.